Hey everyone, welcome back to A Climber's Mind. This is a really exciting time for my podcast because episode 10 marks the end of this foundational period that I set myself. I wanted to use the first 10 episodes as a chance to learn my voice, wrap my head around editing, recording, all that kind of stuff. So this is the first episode that I'll be doing where it's not structured beforehand. I'm actually doing it on the fly, which, if I'm honest, is a little bit nerving for me because naturally I'm not that great at speaking. For the first 13 years of my life, I was in a behavioural school and I didn't actually learn any basic English until pretty much until I was 13. So I had this catch-up period of a few years where I basically had to learn everything and get through my GCSEs. But it's meant a lot of the basic rules around English I had to learn later on in life. So I think just speaking on the fly like this is something that I generally struggle with quite a lot. But one thing that I'm going to be doing with the podcast moving forward is I want to invite some guests on, and that's going to involve me having to just talk to them on a one-to-one basis. So yeah, I'm going to have to be a little bit more comfortable with just speaking my thoughts and going from there. I've just got a better mic as well, so I was previously using fairly cheap mics that weren't designed for this kind of thing, and I've just got a mic that actually should do the job really well. So one thing I'm going to be talking about in this current episode is where my life is at right now. It's a really interesting time of my life because it's for the first time in 10 years. My life isn't just centered around my performance. It kind of is, but in a much more indirect way. So what I've been doing is I've been trying to reorganize my life so that it works around my performance in a much more healthy way, reducing friction, reducing stress, and giving me the mental space and clarity to work on my coaching, work on my climbing, and get this podcast up and running. So I've just completed 2 months of structured training, which I haven't really done before. I've kind of done a little bit of training here and there. I've followed training plans in the past, but skipped a lot of sessions, things like that. Whereas this training plan that I've done for the last 2 months, I've only actually skipped 2 sessions, and they weren't really skipped. I basically just went to the crag instead of doing a board session. I tailored the intent so that I was making sure that I was doing the right stimulus on that day, but essentially just doing it on rock instead of wood, which I think works really well. And yeah, it's pretty great. I'm feeling physically really strong. And I've been testing myself on Free at Last, the 9.0 Plus that I've been trying at Dumbarton Rock. And having this project alongside the training is really interesting because it gives me a really constant medium to practice my strength and to see where I'm at and to, understand how much growth I need to make in order to actually be at the point where I want to be to send this route. It's kind of interesting because the individual moves are feeling a lot easier, but what I'm finding is that my rock intuition, my movement and my flow state isn't as effective as it was. So I don't feel like I'm moving that well, but I feel like I'm physically stronger and the moves are actually feeling way more reliable as a result. One thing that is definitely apparent as well is that I'm really proud of myself for sticking with this training plan because it doesn't come easy for me to have this kind of routine and structure. Even though that's really good for me, I really like being able to just kind of jump in my car, sod off out into the mountains or to the crag and just focus on what I feel like on the day. It kind of sounds quite chaotic that, but I've usually got a big project on. So, I'll just keep turning up to the crag with a goal in mind in order to build on links that I've done or try a particular boulder problem, work on a particular move, or, maybe even try and tick some stuff. So it was never completely disorganized what I was doing previously, but what I'm doing now is completely structured and even down to the number of attempts that I'm allowed to actually have on the wall. So I'm really closely monitoring my recovery and my tracking the intensity of all the workouts that I'm doing. So it's really interesting just seeing how when you do it like this, everything compounds and it starts to all make sense and you start to realize that, little things being out of routine. So if I'm more dehydrated than usual, if I didn't sleep right, if I haven't ate properly, all these things, you get to really analyze and observe the patterns that are going on in your life. So it's been a really interesting period. And throughout this, I've of course been running the podcast and getting that started, which has been a really exciting learning curve for me. Starting this podcast was something that I've been really excited about for years. I've been wanting to do it for years, and I've kind of always been afraid of not saying the right thing, or people just finding it boring, or even just my insecurities around the way that I talk, just knowing that I'm maybe not the most articulate guy in the world, but perhaps maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I can show the world that you don't need to be the most articulate guy in order to communicate some interesting information that may or may not help you get better at climbing. But something else that's really interesting is I've been observing the importance of attention and how that shapes everything. So whilst I have been kind of keeping on top of everything, like I've been running my coaching for like the last 5 years, I've been doing some hard climbs, I've had vehicles running, I've also had vehicles not running. But one thing I realised was that I was so vulnerable to anything that might disrupt that situation, because I was so like scatterbrained almost. Like my coaching would be like, I'd kind of pick it up with each client as and when it was going on. There wasn't really much organisation to it. My training was, again, just kind of all over the shop. It was just like, I was kind of doing a fingerboard session once a week, just as and when I felt like it. And then I was going out on rock just when I felt fresh enough, or just when I needed to get out and get some fresh air. But the interesting thing is, and the thing that was affecting me the most, was actually the stuff in the background. Stuff like not having my finances up to check, and having things wrong with my car, or feeling like I'm not organised enough in my coaching, and knowing that I could be doing a better job with all that stuff. And just in terms of life admin, just being really behind with everything all the time was really eating away at me every time I was going to the crag. So it's been a really interesting learning curve recently, just realising that actually organising your life helps bring about more mental clarity, and it means that whenever I apply myself to any task, I'm able to really just focus on it. And I don't have any mental noise or as much distraction. I'm not sitting there thinking I should be doing something else, or I should be concentrating on my work. I can just actually go climbing or focus on my coaching with no distractions and just put my full attention into it. And that has all come down to just improving organisation. Something that I've realised quite recently as well is that ever since I first climbed Hubble, my identity has been so dependent on my climbing performance. And whilst I had a lot of external success, or what you might view as external success, I had a lot of like internal vulnerability and I was really insecure. And that distorted my perspective of what was realistic. Every time I'd be scrolling on social media, I'd be like, I'd see somebody's done something, I'd be like, oh no, like I need to go out and do something and, make sure I'm keeping up. And, if I knew I hadn't sent for a while, I'd be thinking like, oh man, I just need to like get something sent, put it online so I can like, keep brands happy, keep my business flowing, and, just kind of keep on top of everything, stay in the loop. And, like that, because of that stress and panic that I had present with that, it meant that I just kind of ignored the other facets of my life, and I wasn't able to concentrate the way that I wanted to whenever I was doing climbing or coaching. And as a result, like if there was, let's say like a really good climber came to the crag one day and I was there, I would just kind of feel pretty threatened and like, I don't know, just like I should be keeping up. I think it's the only way I can describe it. Like it's nothing to do with them. It's just in myself. It's just like I've always felt like I should be doing more. And one thing that's really interesting is ever since I've organised my life, my motivation just feels so much healthier. It's just really nice being able to climb just for my own enjoyment and not out of insecurity, which is quite hard to admit sometimes. I think a lot of people experience this and they don't want to admit it. They don't want to admit it to themselves, let alone other people. I certainly was hiding it from myself for quite some time. But, when you actually take hold of your priorities and organise everything, it's really clear then, once you come out of that actually having your life in good order, having solid foundations is actually much better for you mentally. And now I feel much more mentally free and unburdened from the chaos that I had before. One thing that I'm going to be doing with the podcast moving forward is I'm going to start bringing on some guests. So I've got some really exciting conversations coming up soon where I'm hopefully going to be exploring things like pressure, fear, identity, obsession, and, you know, any other kind of moving parts between climbing performance and psychology. And two guys that I've already agreed to do this is Mike Boyd and Conrad Caddy. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about these guys, but one thing that is going to be so interesting is exploring the mind of climbing through the lens of somebody else's perspective. So you've already heard a lot about my perspective and what I think works for me and for my clients, but wouldn't it be interesting to actually hear it from the mouth of somebody else and how their relationship with climbing differs to mine or somebody else's? I'll talk a little bit about Conrad Caddy after this, but first, I want to talk about Mike Boyd. So Mike Boyd is like I guess he's a YouTuber. He's got two YouTube channels. One is on learning kind of abstract skills. I think it's really interesting. He kind of learns really bizarre things like seen all sorts, like trying to break a glass through singing, learning to solve a Rubik's Cube really fast, or I think he actually did a video on climbing, and that's what initially got him into climbing. And then from that point, he started his own climbing YouTube channel, it's quite interesting. It's actually almost like on performance and his journey through becoming a better climber, which is so interesting. It's really absorbing. And if you haven't watched his videos, I'd really recommend it. Anyway, the key thing about Mike Boyd is that he's not been climbing that long, and he's already climbing 7B. And I find that really fascinating because he didn't start climbing really young, and naturally he's probably not the strongest guy in the world. Like, it's not as if he's got into climbing being from like a gymnastics background or anything like that. So like his body's just, no disrespect to Mike, but he's just a fairly average guy, which is what makes him so special because that's not his strength. The amazing thing about Mike Boyd is his brain. The way he learns, he's so curious and analytical and observational. Like you can just see that his brain's constantly piecing everything together, and he's taking in bits of information that you say to him, and you can just see he's really good at being able to apply that to his own experience and then compare it, see what works, see what doesn't work, and then, find his own path, which I think is absolutely incredible. And I'm really looking forward to having this conversation with Mike to learn about his approach through climbing and, how he can continue to make his relationship with climbing better and maybe even improve his performance as well. So Conrad Caddy, you've probably not heard of him. I hadn't heard of him until really recently. He actually sent me a message on Instagram maybe 6 months ago. And this was the first time I heard about him. So I just decided to have a little look through his Instagram because I was curious, and I'd seen that he's climbed like multiple A+ boulder problems. I didn't realise at the time, but he actually hadn't been climbing very long. And then recently, last week, he sent his first 8B boulder problem, or V13, with his ascent of Superman at Crag X in the Peak District. It's actually a really famous boulder problem. I've never tried it myself, but it's notorious for being incredibly hard. I've seen the holds on it, and they're freaking tiny. It's like a properly basic bit of climbing. It's not the kind of thing that you can just sneak around with some techie beta. You need to be really strong to stand a chance of doing it. And Conrad did it after 3 years of climbing, which, if you kind of think about it, is nuts. To develop that level of finger strength and body tension after not been climbing for all that long. I'm really interested to see how he's done that, how he's made that happen. So I already had a bit of a conversation with him on Instagram, and one of the first things he said to me was that, he seems to adapt well to physical training. Now, I'm interested to see if I'm right or wrong with this observation, but I personally don't believe it's really that simple. I think he might view it that way because his perspective of performance is only through his own lens. But I bet he's got a good understanding of sports performance, training and psychology and sports science. And I bet you he is applying really good training principles to what he's doing. And that is how he's becoming really good. Now, one thing that I want to make clear is that these training principles are really important. But the one thing that is not often mentioned that is really, really important with every athlete is attention to detail and learning to really observe the very subtleties of your performance and just focus with every exercise and every bit of movement you do. And that requires obsession. And there's one thing I realised about Conrad, he is obsessed. You know, you can just tell he just wants it so badly. So it's going to be really interesting to have a conversation with him about what has been, you know, the underlying psychological benefits to him becoming what he is now. So I'm really interested to see how that actually, how that conversation actually goes. Now, I know for many people that are listening, they're probably going to be curious to hear about what I'm actually currently doing with my training. And the key thing is I'm doing 3 sessions a week, and it's mostly centered around fingerboarding, board climbing, and then a little bit of conditioning on the side. So I'm doing some max pull-ups, some lock-offs, some scapular stability stuff, and some calf stretching as well to help improve my knee bars. Basically, what I'm doing is on a Monday, I'm doing a fairly reasonably sized fingerboard session at 80% intensity. So 4 sets half crimp, 4 sets open hand. And then after that, I'm doing some kilterboard climbing where I'm focusing more on shouldery moves as opposed to fingery climbing, just because my fingers are already a little bit fatigued from the fingerboard session. And then I finish off with just a little bit of like 6 or 7 RPE scapular stability stuff. So I do some scapular pull-ups and some external rotation. And then that's my session all done. I'm only having 10 efforts on the wall with that whole session as well. And then on Wednesday, I do a pretty similar session, but I'll start with max pull-ups, lock-offs, rows, and a little bit of scapular work as well. And then I'll go into a moonboard session, which is way more fingery than the shouldery kilterboard. So it kind of swaps the stimulus a little bit because my shoulders are fatigued from the max pull-ups. It's just better if I focus on more fingery climbing, which it doesn't feel quite so hindered then because of the fatigue in my shoulders. And then on Friday's session, I'm just doing a very intentional board session where I'm focusing on high quality efforts. And one thing that's really important is for all of these sessions that I'm doing, one of the key things is that I'm really, really intentional every single time I put any training effort in. Whether that's on the wall or whether that's through an exercise, I'm really focusing on good quality movement, making sure that I'm as smooth as possible and that I'm breathing properly and that I'm thinking about the projects, thinking about the things that I'm motivated for and, just doing everything with really good quality. One thing I've been experimenting with on this training plan is the importance of quality over intensity. So I'm not operating at my absolute max for pretty much any of the exercises. For the fingerboarding, I'm working at 80%. For the max pull-ups, again, 80%. And if I'm doing any kipping, if the form goes at all, then I'll just drop the intensity ever so slightly and then re-pick it up next week with better form. And it's just been really interesting because, basically, unless the quality is perfect, then I don't progress the exercise. So I don't increase the intensity unless the form is exactly as it should be. And it might sound a little bit weird because, the macho thing is, you try really hard and you train and that equals results. But I'm not sure if I really believe that is really that helpful in climbing because climbing isn't just a sport of trying hard. It's also a sport of learning how to relax. And I think it's important with training to understand that focus is really important and, learning about how that intuition helps you when you're actually climbing. Basically what I'm doing is I'm working at as high intensity as possible to promote adaptation, but without affecting the quality. So the quality of everything that I'm doing, I need to make sure my form is great. And I'm like with the fingerboarding, for example, I'm actively thinking about curling my fingers into the holds, which It's quite interesting. A lot of people have been talking about this clawing in holds recently on fingerboards. And, I don't want to just be like one of those guys that just jumps on trends and, kind of annoys me when like one person says one thing and all of a sudden every coach and every athlete on the planet is then going on banging on about this revelation that they've almost as if they've come up with it. But in all honesty, it's a really good bit of advice. And I actually think as far as trends go, it's a really useful trend because it basically demonstrates that you're not working right at your limit because you need to leave a little bit of reserve in order to get that active engagement on the holds or on the fingerboard. And that's actually really applicable to climbing because the growth that you make is through the intention of the active pulling rather than the passive hanging that you would do with more weight. And what I mean by that is when you are doing those passive hangs, it just means that the skin just kind of bunches up on the hold, and it means that you can add more weight, but your form is crap and you're kind of passively hanging on your skin as opposed to your tendons. Now, the negative side to this is that tendon and muscular adaptation requires there to be a really high intensity, and you need to kick your body out of homeostasis. And the only way you can do that is by subjecting a higher load than what your body is previously used to. So you do need to progressively overload. But one thing that I've been finding is that because I'm operating at 80% and not my total limit, and what I am measuring is the quality, I can still progressively overload, but I'm not focusing on how much weight I'm pulling up. I'm focusing on how those hangs feel. So if I complete the last set and it feels really good, like let's say, on the final set, my form stays decent and I've got like a second or two in reserve at the end of that last set, then I would say that's a good quality set. And then I'll increase it by 0.5 kilograms or a bit more than a pound, I guess, is for Americans. And then that then enables me to keep progressing the exercise each week in a very linear way. And I can tell you for a fact, I am getting stronger. My numbers are going up, the quality is going up, my form is easier to maintain, and my execution on the wall is feeling better. So even though it kind of sounds a little bit kind of backwards focusing on it that way, it does seem to be working for me. And then I'm applying the same principles to my climbing as well. So when I'm doing any board climbing, I'm really focusing on the quality of each attempt so that I'm trying hard, I'm getting all the holds really well, I'm locking into positions and moving really nicely as well as I can. Whereas I used to just go to the wall and if I did a board session, I'll just try the hardest things I could possibly try and do like one or two moves max most of the time. Whereas now I'm operating actually one grade below my kind of flash level just to maintain the quality. And then I'm really focusing on trying to execute every boulder with perfection. And then only doing 10 boulders not even 10 boulders, 10 efforts per session. So if I fall off, that still counts as an effort. The only time I wouldn't include it as an effort is if let's say I fall off like one or two moves in and, my foot pops or something like that, then obviously it's not really an effort. You just kind of like, it's a wasted effort. So what I'll do then is I'll just rest for another 2 minutes and then pull back on. But any other time I'm making sure I'm resting absolutely a minimum of 5 minutes. I'm brushing the holds, I'm visualizing, I'm imagining myself climbing through the moves with perfection. And then when I jump on the wall, I focus on my breathing and execution. And it's really fascinating because I feel really great on the boards. I can feel the capacity, the quality, and my ability improving on these board climbs, despite the fact that I'm not even working at my true limit. It's really fascinating. So I'm really interested to see how this actually does result in gains, whether it will or will not actually help me on free at last. And so far, I can fairly confidently say that it seems to be working. Of course, there's variations such as conditions, and it's any progress that I make on a route like this is always really marginal. But the moves are definitely becoming more repeatable, and that is the real key with what I'm doing at the moment. And it's, really anchoring my motivation to know that I am, in fact, making progress. I'm moving the needle and I'm feeling really good. So yeah, a very exciting time in my training. Finally, the last thing I wanted to talk about was my coaching. And I don't want to talk about it from like a promotional standpoint because, we're all getting a bit fed up of promotion these days with like all the crap that you see online and on telly and adverts everywhere. And, sometimes we just want to hear about like what's actually going on behind closed doors. Now, one thing that I'll say is that historically with my coaching, it was a means to an end. I basically wanted to do the coaching to earn money so that I could go climbing. And I think some people would be afraid to admit that if they're kind of like trying to portray a certain image. But I think it must have been pretty obvious to people that it was just, in fact, just a way for me to earn money and go climbing. But over the last, I would say particularly over the last 2 years, but really, really over the last 6 months, I've properly knuckled down with my coaching. And I've been learning so much. I've been reading loads of books and I've been just putting like so much more attention into every athlete. I speak for an hour with each client once per month on the phone, which is done with a video call. I then I either adapt the plan or I write them a new plan based on that phone call. And I've got loads of tools in place to help me just do like an excellent job and be really present with these phone calls. And then all the information that I discuss with my clients is then fed back into the training plans. And honestly, I feel really great about it. Like I've never felt like I was doing the best job I could be with my coaching. And I always knew I could do a better job. I always knew what I wanted it to be. And I worked really hard at my coaching before, but I just didn't have the mental space in order to really make it what I wanted it to be. But because I've been organising my life and organising everything around my work and my climbing, it's just enabled me to just put so much more concentration into the work that I am doing. So with each client, they're getting the utmost attention and I'm able to give them exactly what they need in order to improve. The diagnostics that I'm running early on is also much more accurate. So we're going through psychology, lifestyle, physical metrics, technique, video analysis, just the whole lot. Any bit of information that I can get at the start, I run through it all. And then I produce a working hypothesis. We jump on the phone, chat about it, make sure I've interpreted the information correctly. Then I'll work with them to kind of map out a rough plan on that same call. And then once I've got all that information, I sit down for a good few hours and write a really detailed training plan that goes into every facet of performance that is relevant for their growth. And that the really important part of that is diagnosis comes first, and then I pick a primary limiter, and then we work on one primary limiter at a time. And that's not just a physical metric like what most people tend to focus on these days. If their primary limiter is their lifestyle, we'll work on improving their lifestyle. If their primary limiter is technique, we'll focus on that. And it's just really, really nice that I've finally got my coaching where I've wanted it to be for such a long time. One thing that I really like to do with my clients is not just tell them what to do and just let them get on with it. I like to educate them on why it is the way that it is. So I really sit down and I explain, okay, the reason why this is what we're focusing on is because this is the background noise behind this symptom that you've got. And then that then means that we're able to get right to the core of the problems and, raise the floor so that it matches the ceiling of their performance and they're able to actually express themselves the way that they've desire and often dream to do. And I really feel like I'm able to help my clients and work in a way that, it just makes me feel really good. Honestly, I can do a great day at work, sat down at my desk, working with my clients, and I'll go out climbing. I'm just sat there with a smile on my face because I know that I've just changed somebody's life. And obviously that's not all the time. I'm not doing that every single call that I have. But I do feel like most of the calls that I have at least a bit of information that those clients can take with them, and it helps them grow and become, a more well-rounded version of themselves. And it's just really nice to be that person for them. But anyway, today was a slightly longer episode than usual. There was probably a fair bit of waffling. I hope that I'll get a little bit better at talking as these podcasts go on. But I would like to just thank you for being here and being part of this journey with me. It's honestly such a blessing to have this podcast running already to what it is. I've got a loyal group of people that are already invested in what I'm doing. And if you are one of those people, I just want to say thanks so much. Like, it really is great knowing that I've got the backing of people around me that are getting value out of the work that I put in with stuff. And yeah, I really appreciate it. And I hope to meet you at the Crag. If you're one of the people listening and we do happen to bump into each other, please just come and say hi. I might be a little bit awkward initially. It depends what mood I'm in. Sometimes I'm super extroverted and excited. Sometimes I'm a total introvert and I just want to be left alone. So if I am a little bit weird, then I do apologise. I'm just a weird guy. But I do love hearing about other people's experiences and also their love for climbing. So if we do happen to bump into each other, just come and say hi. Honestly, I'd love to chat. Thanks a lot, guys. I'm looking forward to doing these collaborations soon, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode.